Okay, hello again, everybody. Um, Feeling much better today. It's weird these days. You feel even the slightest amount sick, and you're like, oh shit, do I have the Rona? But I don't know. I just felt a little bit ill the other day, but that's okay. That sort of puts me one lecture behind on my schedule. I'm not going to record 3 today. I'm just going to do 2 and go from there. We have a little bit of leeway since I canceled the project. I have kind of lectures to spare or your time to spare. So I think we're okay just being like a little bit behind on that schedule. Um, but let's just get in to this lecture with how the Americans are finally going to take California. And this begins in Texas. Like I said, we obviously saw, the Americans wanted California already. But the war itself, the Mexican-American War, is going to begin in Texas. And I don't want to go into very much detail about this because this is not an American history class, definitely not a Texas history class. But essentially, there was the Mexican state of Tejas was a lot like California. It's far from Mexico City. They were doing their own things. They considered themselves to be fairly independent from the rest of Mexican culture through the 1820s and 30s. And during that time, Americans started moving in, and just like in California, it said, hey, great, you guys are welcome if you convert to Catholicism, if you become Mexican citizens. The first few of them did, but as more Americans showed up, they stopped bothering to necessarily do that, and they stayed Protestant. They stayed, they kept their American citizenship. They just wanted to live here and farm this land, and they brought slavery with them, which was a big deal. These were Southern Americans. They're coming right over from Louisiana, and expanding there, and they're farmers, and Southern farmers were slave owners at this time. So the Mexican Republic was, in the early 1830s, was kind of falling apart and wasn't really able to do anything about that, even though slavery was illegal, throughout all of Mexico and in Tejas. There wasn't anything you can do about it until eventually General Santa Anna takes over in 1835. Which is essentially, this will change into a new form of government, sort of the dictator, a military dictatorship under him, but he's still, slavery is still illegal. He raises up an army to go back to Texas to put them back in line. These Americans are breaking the law with slavery, and at that point, the Americans have been doing what they've been doing for about a decade now, and they're kind of like, well, no, this is our land. We're declaring independence, and they're doing this with, not just with the Tejas Mexicans. Definitely had some mixed feelings about the Americans, but a lot of them were on board and felt like, this was a better future for them than, it would definitely be better for them economically. So enough of the Tejas Mexicans were on board with these Americans that are now, considering themselves Texans, and they declare, we are the Republic of Texas. You can't, General Santa Anna and his invading army, essentially. And this is when you get the Alamo, where those Davy Crockett, Jim Bowie, and those people die, but that gives enough time for Sam Houston to raise an army, and he's eventually able to push Santa Anna out of Texas. And for 9 years, Texas remains, considers itself to be an independent republic. Santa Anna doesn't recognize that this is an independent republic, and always kind of says, like, I'm coming back, like, and I'm going to take Texas. You can't steal this from me. He doesn't recognize Texas as a republic. The United States does, but always with the intention. Everybody knew all along that Texas was not really going to be able to hold its own for a long time. There's not necessarily a long-term plan, but Americans didn't want they're having a hard time figuring out how to annex Texas and make it part of the United States, because it was this new large slave state. And especially Northern Americans did not like letting this big new slave state into the Union. So you have this sort of 9 years where Texas is its own country. But eventually, President James K. Polk is elected essentially just off of the whole idea, like, he's like, the only thing I'm going to do, I'm going to bring Texas into the Union. I have a plan. I'm going to make this work. We're going to bring Texas in. I'm going to bring in new territories too. And it is like, and when that's done, I'm going to step down. I only want to run this one term. And that's essentially what he does. So they annex Texas into the United States in 1845. And right away, they consider their border to be, the United States considers their border to be at the Rio Grande River. Texas says, fine, we recognize, or Mexico recognizes, okay, that's part of the United States, but the border is actually the Nejas River, I think it's pronounced, the Nejas River, which is a little bit further north. So there's a sort of like gap where that's like a disputed territory. Both sides claim that it's their country. So Polk just sends the American military into this gap, saying, oh, we're going to go patrol our border along the Rio Grande. They inevitably run into some Mexican soldiers who are patrolling what they think is their land. They fight a little skirmish, and this is the beginning of the war. It was really always the intention to start a war because of this. So that's how the Mexican-American War begins. Most of that war is going to be fought in central Mexico. The Americans are going to fight their way down until they eventually get to Mexico City and take Mexico City by force and force a surrender. And they'll be able to make demands what they want after winning that. We're not going to talk about any of that because none of that's in California. We're just going to talk about the California part of the war, but just know the war is won, not here in California, but in Mexico. What is there? Okay, never mind. I thought I had another slide for something else. So the California part of that, just like where we saw Commodore Thomas Catesby Jones had standing orders to head up to Monterey and conquer it, as soon as war broke out between California and Texas, or California, as soon as war broke out between Mexico and the United States, he was supposed to take California in 1842. And that's what he did, even though the war hadn't started. Well, those standing orders were still in effect when the real war did break out. Now, a guy named Commodore John D. Sloat had those orders. As soon as the war breaks out, he beelines straight for Monterey, California, which is different than the Monterey. There's many battles of Monterey. There's actually a couple, or 2 or 3 different battles that happen in a place called Monterey, Mexico, that you can see on this map. And has Monterey spelled with 2 R's. That's actually in Mexico. Monterey with 1 R is the one in California. So there really was not a battle of Monterey. Sloat was able to take it very easily, just as as happened in 1842. They're able to force the surrender. The only shots fired was a 21-gun salute. Celebrating, after they put up the American flag, the ships put up a 21-gun salute. And actually, there was only a skeleton crew that was like at Monterey. Most of the loyal Mexican forces had pulled out of Monterey, knowing the Americans were coming, and decided we're going to make our stand near Los Angeles. There was more people loyal to Mexico in Southern California, so if we're going to make a stand, we have to do it around Los Angeles. So they retreated and headed down there, and just like that, California technically was now an American territory. They have to officially, pacify, the Mexican forces there. They still have to win a few battles. They're relatively minor battles. They're going to fight near Los Angeles, but for all intents and purposes, when they take the capital of Monterey, they becomes an American territory. there was also something else that was going on behind the scenes. This is at a time that communication is very, it is really hard. They can't coordinate. There was a land effort to, weaken the Mexican hold in California that was happening separately than John D. Sloat's invasion of Monterey. And that involves a guy named John C. Fremont. And Fremont is a much more popular figure than Sloat. Sloat's got a street named after him in San Francisco, but not too much else. Fremont, there's a Fremont Street in basically every city in California. There's Fremont, the city, that is, just south of Cal State East Bay. It's named after this guy. And he plays a much larger role in California history. So before I get into what he was doing in California, let's talk a bit about him and who he was. So he's an interesting figure. He's a Southerner by birth. He was born in Georgia, raised in Virginia, spent a fair amount of time in Missouri. So he's definitely a Southerner, but his family was not a slaveholding family. Apparently, the story, it's kind of a good story of his birth in general. His family's kind of poor because he's basically the bastard love child of two star-crossed lovers that was never meant to be, kind of thing. But I don't know. So his mother was a beautiful young woman who had been married off, not necessarily by her choice, to this old rich plantation owner when she was just a teenager. And that old man wanted his wife to be educated. So he hires this handsome, charming French-Canadian immigrant school teacher to be his wife's private tutor. And something's wrong. If you're having to educate your wife like she's your daughter, that's kind of gross. But anyway, he made a poor choice in hiring this handsome, charming, young French-Canadian immigrant school teacher by the name of John Fremont. The two, the student and teacher took a little, fell in love relatively quickly. I'm not sure how much older than he was. He was probably older too, just not as old. But they fell in love and ran away together, and went off and started their new life. They're not rich. She's not, doesn't have that money anymore, but they have each other, kind of thing. And the son that they have is our John C. Fremont here. And he himself will be involved in a kind of romantic forbidden love sort of thing when he gets married, but we'll get to that too. So unlike most Southerners, Fremont was relatively indifferent towards slavery and early in life, and then later was very much adamantly against it. He'll actually be the first nominee for the Republican Party when they form in the 1850s. With their sole purpose is containing slavery. They're like the anti-slavery party, and he is their presidential nominee. That also says about something about his public profile in the 1850s and how popular he was. He joins the military as a young man. At first, he's a teacher himself on a U.S. Navy vessel, but that's not enough adventure. He's always seeking adventure. Apparently, he was a very smart guy in school, but he got expelled for inattendance. He was kind of a guy who's just sort of unsettled and always wanted to be like on the go, getting into adventures, doing things like that. So he joined the U.S. Topographical Corps, which sounds like something boring, but that was where the action was, in the 1820s and 30s when he's starting out, because those were the guys that mapped the West. They were the ones who were going out into the frontier and, seeing what's out there. They're mapping, they're making reports, battling Indians at certain times. I'm sorry, I'm gonna open my window real quick. I really wish I could be running my air conditioner, but it'll be way too loud while I'm recording. So he, in this job, he really distinguishes himself really quickly as a frontiersman, as a military leader, but also as a scientist. He's very meticulous about documenting everything he sees, plants and animals, and discoveries. He's everything he encounters along the way. He makes really good maps. While he's doing this, he befriends a powerful senator from Missouri, a guy named Thomas Hart Benton, who is a giant in American politics at this time, the senator. And Thomas Hart Benton was obsessed with westward expansion. He was really, the guy pushing for manifest destiny, and that is, we have to map the West. We have to push out the native people who live there and start settling Americans. That was, his big thing. And while, they have this professional relationship because, Benton wants this politically, and he's sponsoring this young hotshot topographical engineer guy, the guy who's actually on the ground going and doing this stuff. But through the professional relationship, Fremont, who was 28 at the time, meets the senator's 16-year-old daughter, whose name is Jessie Hart Benton. And do I have a slide for her? Yeah, Jessie Hart Benton. The two fall madly in love and elope. They, before anybody even finds out what is going on, they take off and secretly get married. It sounds kind of, 16 and 28 sounds huge. At the time, that was really not looked on to be as that big a deal. If husband is 40 years somebody's senior or something like that, people are saying, okay, that's kind of gross. 12 years, not that big a deal. People getting married at 16, definitely relatively common at this time. But when Senator Benton found out what happened, he was furious with Fremont because even though he really liked Fremont, he was a low-born frontier scientist. He was a nobody. And Jessie was beautiful. She was highly educated. She was really smart and talented. She was already a hit, like in Washington, D.C. Like she was just known as the most eligible bachelorette, like in town. She was already turning away marriage proposals from all kinds of people. And Thomas Hart Benton wanted some sort of political alliance out of whoever she got married to. And this guy, he's just, like I said, he's some lowly, soldier scientist. So he's really upset about the whole deal, but eventually he accepts it because his daughter is truly in love with John Fremont. So he's like, fine, I'll accept him in my family. If he's a low-born soldier scientist, I'm just going to raise his profile. And he becomes even more a greater sponsor and patron to Fremont. And, he's like, if he's going to be my family, he's going to be a big deal too. So he makes sure that Fremont, gets more, known around town, that he, he gets introduced to all the right people. He gets all the good jobs. He gets all kinds of good press and everything. And it needs to be said, Jessie, was not just, arm candy to Fremont or whatever. Like I said, she was incredibly smart person. She will be the much slyer politician of the two. When Fremont becomes a politician himself, it's her that kind of knows how to charm people, how to make deals. She throws parties and invites all the right people, that kind of thing. She's really the the political brains, behind Fremont. And more than that, she's also going to write, they do that, the actual writing on Fremont's books that makes him famous. Before I get into that, there's one that story I spoke about, like after Fremont lives in California, and Jessie goes to join him in 1849. She has to take a boat, all the way around South America to get there. And when she gets, she's the only woman on this boat. There's all these guys that are trying to get to the gold rush, and sort of like rough men, they're going to be on this ship for months. And the captain was worried, like, oh, this young, beautiful woman on a ship with a bunch of men, bad things can happen, for months at a time. But it turns out, like within the week, she was basically running the ship. The whole ship would be wrapped around, like every night they would gather around, and she would tell stories about her husband and about about frontier stuff, about whatever. She would tell these great stories, and everybody would be completely wrapped around everything that she said. And the captain ended up saying that like the bigger problem, rather than anybody attacking her, were fights that would break out about who wanted to defend her more, like who was more loyal. She's like 24 years old at the time, and all these people are like, who's more loyal to protect Jessie Fremont? So I don't know. It gives you an idea of the type of person she was. But her husband is more famous and is in quite a bit of action. And there's two things that he does that are super important to the United States, to California, to the West, to just the American character in general. So one is a very obvious sort of thing, is that he maps all this stuff. That's his job, is to go out on all these things and map the West. The maps that he makes are the maps that the Donner Party is going to use. Well, they won't use his, like, to take the wrong one, but all these sort of wagon trains that are on their way west, they're following those maps. They know where to go because Fremont mapped that stuff. So literally, he is showing people how to move west. What's harder to define, but maybe even a bigger deal, are the books that he writes change Americans' attitude about the frontier. They get people excited about the West in general. Up until this point, people had viewed the frontier as something that's scary, and only the very toughest of mountain men would go into the frontier like that. And there's Indians everywhere that want to kill you, and people were really scared of it. But like Fremont had this very romantic view of what he saw and talked about how beautiful everything was and about how there's new opportunities to be had for people out in the West. So, come in. She's coming. My wife coming to get my dog.
Oh, sorry.
Oh. She woke him up. All of these sort of just, it got, what Americans made, the beginning of how Americans changed their conception of what the frontier and what the West was. That will go a long way towards how we view ourselves on a whole. Like the West, in this sort of attitude, it changes the American character, this sort of cowboy culture, but it was not something that was part of what Americans were before. Later on, Teddy Roosevelt, New York, Eastern aristocrat, moves to the Dakotas and gets tough in the West, and he has this sort of rough Western attitude and becomes president and sort of brings that sort of, rugged American individualism into the culture. Wild West shows, there's so many things like about how Americans view themselves and how people outside of the United States view us that are connect to this sort of Western view. And that really begins with Fremont. And it's also worth pointing out that, like I said, Jessie wrote those books for the most part. Fremont was having those experiences and documented everything like a soldier scientist. He had been sort of just dry notes of everything that he was seeing, and then he sent that stuff back to Jessie, and she would write it up in a much more romantic and easier to read narrative, better prose for the American public. So it was really the combination of those things. No, the books would not have sold if they were just written in his the way he wrote it. But he trusted his wife to be able to write this stuff, and his name is on the cover of the books. Though these days I think a lot of them publish his books now have both their names on the covers. But at the time, it was just his. But it was her actual writing. So again, she was incredibly important to this team that they have. So that is who Fremont is, and he gets the nickname the Pathfinder. And he becomes a celebrity. You don't think of some soldier scientist as being a celebrity, but it's because of those books he becomes one of the most famous Americans in the country. So on one of his trips that he's making to California, before he comes, he gets orders from President James K. Polk. We're not exactly sure what those orders are, but we know that it basically he's to do something in California. He's supposed to undermine Mexican authority in California. And he can't just do this outwardly. He can't do this as an agent of the United States. He has to find other ways to be able to do that, essentially. And we don't know, Fremont had sort of said different versions. It was very cagey about what his orders were. Polk died not that long after he stepped down from the presidency. But on this trip to California, Fremont is intent on causing trouble. And one of the things that he does is he shows up outside Monterey, and this is before Monterey gets conquered. This is before the war actually starts. He shows up in Monterey and just outside, puts up a fort, like a defensive position, and puts up an American flag. And the Californios, were, what are you doing? This is like that's a very provocative thing to do. If everyone's, oh, I'm just here to talk to Thomas Larkin, I'm just check it out. But after he's camped out there for a while, General Jose Castro came out of Monterey and basically threatened, like, hey, if you don't leave, I have 1,000 men and you have 50. And Fremont still would seem to be like, well, fine, like my 50 men will whip your 1,000. But then they one night they just left. They just disappeared. They go north, leave California for a little bit. They're up in Oregon, get into some very questionable and problematic interactions with Indians. One of the guys that's with Fremont is a guy named Kit Carson. You might have heard of before, a very famous tracker. One of those guys that, if you are in the middle of nowhere, you're 1,000 miles from, civilization or from anybody who speaks the same language as you. Kit Carson is a guy that knows how to survive out there. But unfortunately, Carson also really hated Native Americans and seemed to want to pick fights with them. And some of the stuff they do up in Oregon seems to have been really attacking villages for no reason. The Fremont's team got attacked and they responded by burning down some innocent villages. It is questionable. They get a little heart of darkness up there, and yeah. But anyway, they come back into California, and the war is just about to start. And they're doing this, but they don't know that. Again, like the fighting has already broken out around Texas, but Fremont doesn't know that. He's a long way, but he knows war is pending, and he goes to Sutter's Fort and starts causing trouble. I should really add a slide for this next piece here, but you're just gonna have to listen to what I say. So he starts, like I said, a lot of Americans had been settling around Sutter's Fort in recent years, and he starts agitated and like, hey, don't you guys hate how the Mexicans treat you? And most of them are kind of like, the Mexicans are fine with us. We don't have any problem with that. And it seems Fremont, like, he ends up with a note that everybody is pretty sure now was faked, talking about basically like this desperate letter written by like an American settler saying like, oh, Mexican soldiers are harassing me. Somebody please come to my aid, kind of thing. But Mexican soldiers really didn't do things like that. So yeah, it's probably fake. And it's really just pretext for what they're going to do next. Fremont convinces all these American settlers, like, don't you want to overthrow the Mexican government and make this an independent nation, the independent republic, the same way Texas is. Like, come on, let's go do that. We can do that. Like the Mexican government, like barely exists here. You know, a breeze will topple them over. But there's really not that enough settlers. There's not enough men, able-bodied men, to be able to go, like, they can't go take Monterey or Yerba Buena, which is San Francisco. They need an easier to take target. And Fremont can't go with them. They can't have American soldiers with them when they're doing this. This has to be their own independent action. You know, these guys who are just inspired by freedom to overthrow the Mexican government. It can't be done by Americans or by American soldiers. So the target they picked to attack is the town of Sonoma and a guy named Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo. It's really an attack on him more than it is about Sonoma, really. So, like I said, they can't take San Francisco, they can't take Monterey, they need an easy target. Sonoma is a tiny little village with just a few dozen people living there. It's Vallejo's family. But Vallejo himself is a very prominent Californian, and technically he's a general in the Mexican army, even though he had never led soldiers into battle. So Vallejo was born in Monterey in 1807. You know, he's a Californian through and through, who was born there under Spanish rule. His grandfather was one of the men who founded Los Angeles. He's related to the Castro families and the Alvarado families, you know, these sort of big names. He's California aristocracy, essentially. He's well educated. He had started out as a clerk. He could speak, aside from Spanish, he speaks perfect English and French. He sort of, like, young Californian men were, enrolled into the Mexican army as cadets in California, even though they weren't really fighting, they weren't doing much, and if you're an officer, you're going to get promoted just basically off of your social standing. They did get into some, small battles with natives and things like that in the 1820s and 30s, but more or less, his military position was ceremonial. But he's got the uniform and everything like that. So, and he had been given this land grant of Sonoma, the area around the mission that was built there, that last Franciscan mission. And they keep adding on to it. They give them what's now Petaluma. They give them what's most of all of Napa. Basically everything that's north of the San Francisco Bay is Vallejo's territory to protect. It's a huge area. So when the Americans are looking for a target, an easily takeable target that has symbolic meaning, Vallejo is the perfect target. He's a general. He is, a major don that has all of this land. And again, he's easily takeable. So the irony of this is, it's supposed to be like, they're doing this under the pretext that Vallejo's men are like abusing Americans, which would be the last thing he would do, because he was very pro-American. He had been the guy that was talking to Thomas Larkin the most about having California peacefully join the United States. He was the guy behind the scenes that's trying to convince the other Californians to do that. Had the war not broken out between Mexico and the United States, he probably would have been able to peacefully convince the other Californians to join the United States. But here they're targeting, making it out like he's a tyrant that they need to put down, to save American lives. It's ridiculous. But these American frontiersmen and settlers, most of them are Mormons. Again, like I said, that was a lot of Mormons that were settling around in this area, but that really not here nor there about any of this. They show up in Sonoma and bang on, very early in the morning, bang on Vallejo's door. He looks out the window and this looks like trouble. Maybe I should put on my uniform. So he puts on his military uniform and comes down, opens the door, and it's like, what can I help you guys with? They say, all right, well, we're negotiating, we're capturing you. and we want to negotiate your terms of surrender for California. Vallejo was like, what? I'm not authorized to surrender California. And like, well, let's talk it out. So, and Vallejo is still, he generally likes Americans, and he's got that California generosity and ideas of hospitality. So he offers them food and wine. He has them bring a giant a giant barrel of wine out of his storage and give it to all of the men out front. There's just a few guys talking to Vallejo inside. All the men out front get this giant barrel of wine. They promptly get totally tanked up, and they do what drunk rough men do. They start harassing the local people. They start looking for more alcohol when someone's out, start breaking things, stuff like that. Eventually, when the guys inside come out and see what's going on, they've been really this really pushes their hand. And William Ide, who was basically their leader, he makes this passionate speech, urging the men of these Americans to declare California independent. It says, choose ye this day what you will be. We be robbers, or we must be conquerors. And I think he's kind of like we're already, if we don't do something big here, we just came looted and pillaged in this town for no reason. So they put up this flag that suddenly got produced out of nowhere somehow, with the one star, for the independent republic, like the Lone Star flag, like of Texas. So the one star of California being an independent republic, and a bear on there. A lot of the California is called the Americans Los Osos, the bears, because they're like big and hairy, I guess. The Americans sort of adopted this, they like this idea, so they put it onto the flag, and sit at the flagpole. And this is, you got an interpretation of this is sort of a bad digital version of the flag here. Do I have another one? Here we go, right here. This is a picture of the actual flag, and this is the model for our flag today. And they put this flag up and say, California is now an independent republic. We're not American. We're not, we're not Mexican. We're now California. The thing is, it was in Sonoma. Like, they didn't take anything like important, and they never do. Some people like to say it's sort of like most historians, will say California was an independent republic because of this. I do not subscribe to this idea, because it was a few dozen guys up in Sonoma who put up a flag. They didn't have a government. They didn't have elections. They didn't actually administer and rule over everything. They were up there for 3 weeks. And then once Fremont comes and meets up with them and heads south, and they meet up with Commodore Sloat, who's in San Francisco at this point, and he's like, what are you talking about? This is not an independent republic. This is American territory. The American military, me, I'm part of the U.S. Navy. I just conquered this. Like, this is not an independent republic. So he shuts the whole idea down. So I don't know. Anybody can put up a flag anywhere and say, like, I declare this to be my land now, and this is in a republic. But that doesn't mean that it's yours. That's essentially what they do. They arrested Vallejo and sent him back to Sutter's Fort. Apparently, some young California men snuck into while they're still in the Sutter's Fort, and they were camping one night. Some men snuck in and were gonna help him escape. And he said, no, I'm going to stay. I'm going to wait and play this thing out, because I want California to be an American territory. Like, he even stayed with them. But unfortunately, when he got to Sutter's Fort, he ended up getting sick while he was imprisoned there. And when he was finally released, he had lost a bunch of weight. He got pinned down like less than 100 pounds or something like that after. And, you can kind of see this, like, he's not a skinny man. But apparently, he was less than 100 pounds when he left. He did recover. He was never in great health again, as far as I know. But he does stay a part of California politics. So eventually he does make it home. But again, I don't think California was an independent republic. They say there's 4 U.S. states that were independent republics. Texas, obviously, Vermont also was. Hawaii, I don't know enough about Hawaiian history to say one way or another on that, and California, but I can take California off that list. Anyway, as Fremont is heading south, he had been to the San Francisco Bay before, as far as I know, but especially on this trip, as they were taking California, permanently, he gives the name, the Golden Gate, to the mouth of the San Francisco Bay. This is where that name comes from. The bridge, obviously not there yet. The bridge is not going to get built until the 1830s. But the name, the Golden Gate, comes from Fremont here in 1847. So this is just really sort of a piece of trivia that I just think it's kind of interesting, I guess. And it's one of those things that, like, I don't know, I used to work as a concierge in San Francisco, and people would come up and ask me, like, where's Golden Gate Park? And I tell them, like, just so you know, like, that's not where Golden Gate Bridge is. And they get, like, mad at me. They're like, what do you mean Golden Gate Bridge is not by Golden Gate Park? And I'm like, well, the name the Golden Gate existed before they built the bridge, and it was already called Golden Gate Park, predates the Golden Gate Bridge. And then they get really mad that we have so many things in the city named Golden Gate. Like, I have somebody asked me 100 years before I was born if we should put the name Golden Gate all over everything. I'm like, dude, I just work here, come on. But anyway, that's a digression. The reason he gives it this name is a reference to the bay at Istanbul, which used to be Constantinople. It was Constantinople for a millennia, and then the Turks took it and renamed it Istanbul, became their capital. But the bay, they also have this great, perfect natural bay, the same way San Francisco is. It's one of these things that it's supposed to be like unconquerable. If it's in a defended position, kind of thing. Obviously, the Turks did conquer it, but Fremont recognized that the San Francisco Bay has this sort of similarity to that bay, and that was always called the Golden Horn. It had that nickname. He names this the Golden Gate, with the golden because of that, and also because he recognized this bay is the gateway to Asia. So that's how it gets the name. Most people think it has something to do with the bridge, which is not even gold. It's red, and it was built, like I said, not until the 1930s. Or they think for a long time, I assumed that had something to do with the gold rush. They took that name after the gold rush. But a year before gold was discovered, here it is, Fremont's giving that the name. So that's the history of that. Fremont, like I said, he meets up with their American officers who don't consider him to be the hero that he thinks he is. He's like, hey, I helped conquer California. And I'm like, dude, we already did that without you. You talked a few dudes into conquering Sonoma. You didn't do that much. Like, we did all of the actual work here. And Fremont, this really upsets him. And they tell him, they're like, okay, you're part of the US military. We're absorbing you. We're going to give you orders and tell you what to do. He says, no, you can't do that. I'm the governor of California. James K. Polk says I'm the governor of California. And for whatever reason, he thinks his orders, make him governor of California. Sloat says, no, I'm governor of California. I was given orders to do this. And there's other military commanders that I'm not going to get into here. It gets confusing. But what essentially Fremont goes rogue. He refuses to absorb his small army into the larger American army, but it still goes around fighting battles. And he gets quite a following. He's a very charismatic guy. He gets the bear flag guys, other people around. Sutter's Fort, already he had his troop from the Topographical Corps. He gets a few other people to join up with him. He's got kind of this ragtag bunch. So you have two separate and independent American armies kind of going around California fighting battles, none of them being big battles. Eventually, Fremont says, fine, I'm going to prove that I am the governor of California. I'm going to go to Washington and talk to Polk myself. So he leaves and starts going west, or starts going east. When he gets to Kansas, he gets arrested. He shows up at a fort, and they're like, "Oh yeah, great, John C. Fremont. Okay, great. We're arresting you because you were disobeying orders. Like a superior commander in California told you what to do, and you didn't do it, and basically you went rogue. So they arrested him, and he gets dishonorably discharged from the U.S. Army. This Fremont is such a popular guy at this time that he's more popular than the president. It ends up making the president look bad. Everybody's like, how dare you do this to American hero John Fremont? You dishonorably discharge him. He's the greatest thing that there's ever been. He's the pathfinder. So they end up symbolically reinstating his position. You take away his dishonorable discharge, and Fremont comes out of the whole thing more popular than ever. And not long after, he'll return to California. He becomes a senator. He becomes one of the first senators of California. Makes a fair amount of money off the gold rush. Apparently, he gets so rich at one point that he's hiding gold in his walls, like in his house. He ends up losing quite a bit of that money, but when he runs for president, yada yada. There's a whole bunch of other stuff that happens in Fremont we're not really going to talk about, but yeah, that's him. So anyway. Like I said, the war is won largely in central Mexico. They work their way down the coast around the Caribbean coast of Mexico, go east and take Mexico City. It's in a small, what was at the time a town, a little town called Guadalupe Hidalgo outside of Mexico City. Now it's Mexico City. Mexico DF has basically absorbed it, and it's just like a neighborhood there, but the peace treaty they negotiate is in this little town, so that's why it's called the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Anyhow, in this deal is that Mexico surrenders, they lose the war, but the U.S. is going to give them $15 million, and for that $15 million, Mexico has to give up Texas, California, Nevada, Utah, New Mexico, Arizona, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. Of course, at the time, pretty much all of that was just called California, just California and Tejas, and everything else was just kind of unnamed territory. But this huge area, pretty much the entire American West, is forever part of the United States. Also part of the deal, any citizens of Mexico who decide to stay will automatically become American citizens. And 90% of the people who are living north of the Rio Grande, who are already there, decide to stay. So we're going to become Americans now. So, and most of the Californians are going to stay. There will be a few people to Mexico, and then they're going to go back across, but most of them are going to stay. And, this is a huge win. Like, we forget sometimes, like the Louisiana Purchase gets a lot of credit, and the Louisiana Purchase was bigger, and Thomas Jefferson gets that credit, but nobody knows James K. Polk, and they don't give him the credit for this massive expansion of American territory. I looked it up too, by the way, which is neither here nor there, just another piece of trivia. So yeah, Louisiana Purchase was the largest single expansion of American territory. It's 8,227 square miles. The Mexican cession that comes in Guadalupe Hidalgo is 5,229 miles. But that's only the third largest acquisition of territory. So Louisiana Purchase was first, this one was second. Can you guess? Or this one was third. This one is third. Louisiana Purchase is first. Can you guess what the second one is? What would be bigger? We need a little time to think on it. Alaska. The acquisition of Alaska in 1869 was 500,086 square miles. So yeah, Alaska's huge. It's bigger than this entire territory here, you know, all these states combined, Alaska is a little bit bigger. Anyway, so with this, you know, you really have, it's just before this too, you know, that the United States negotiates with Britain peacefully, the Oregon Territory. They basically had a long time to figure out like where we're going to make the line between Canada, which is part of the British Empire, and the United States. And, you know, they draw the line. The Oregon Territory is on there. So with this session, we pretty much have the borders of the continental United States as we know it. There is this little tiny bit of called the Gadsden Purchase, a little bit of Arizona and a little bit of New Mexico. We're actually going to talk about that a little bit. It does have a connection to California history, and it's a good story. But otherwise, destiny manifested. The last thing I want to get in this lecture here is this thing called the Wilmot Proviso. Oh wait, there's actually two things to this. So the Wilmot Proviso was a bill in Washington that never actually passes. You're like, why the hell are we learning about this? But it was a bill that it kept being, it's called proviso because it kept getting attached to like different bills and trying to make it law. But throughout the entire Mexican-American War, anti-slavery politicians kept trying to get this proviso passed that would outlaw slavery in any new territory in the United States had taken. Basically, you know, they knew they were going to win this war against Mexico. It was just a matter of when and how much territory they're going to get. This would say, whatever we get, slavery cannot be legal there. And this was a big, big, big deal. It might sound, I don't know if it sounds small or not, but like people cared about this way more than they cared about actually getting California or anything like that, or way more than they cared about the war. Slavery was the issue. And actually the fight over this will end up breaking up. There was the old Whig political party. It used to be the Democrats and the Whigs. The Whigs will fall apart over this issue about whether to support the Wilmot Proviso, and the Republicans will appear a couple of years later after that. And it was, you know, and we're not going to, I don't have to go into a bunch of detail about it, but I'm introducing it here because of this idea of, is slavery going to be allowed in this new territory? And since it didn't get passed, slavery would be allowed. Basically, slavery is legal in all new territories unless something happens to make it illegal. And the only way to do that is become a state. Foreshadowing a little bit there. So I'm just want to introduce that concept here because when we, at our next lecture, it's going to be a very, very big deal. We won't talk about the Wilmot Proviso again, but I mean, the issue is slavery. But I think I have a quiz question that asks you about what this is. So if you ever see it come up there, it's this bill they proposed to outlaw slavery in all new territories won by the Mexican-American War. In the meantime, so they take, the US military now holds California, you know, after they mop up the rest of the Mexican forces. And the military is going to run, we're going to be what little government there is. You know, through these years of the territory, between 1848 or 1847 and 1850, when California becomes a state. And it's run essentially by this alcalde system, which was, the Californians already had this system. And I didn't mention it really because it wasn't terribly relevant. It becomes more relevant now. Basically, this is the legal system of making a don of any given area. The don was, you know, the mayor, he was the judge, you know, like all local authority centered around the don of any given area. So the US military is essentially going to just use this system, but like, and even the map as it is, and just appoint military commanders into those areas. And this essentially makes California a military dictatorship, but actually that's a pretty benevolent one. And they do a pretty good job of it. The US military, like for 3 years, does a pretty effective job, at least as much as could be expected during this time. The alcalde of San Francisco is a guy named Washington Bartlett. He's, at the time, when he takes it over, it's called Yerba Buena. And first thing he does is change the name to San Francisco because he thinks the city should match the name of the bay, which is more famous. And if we're going to be a world-class city, it has to have this world-class name. So from here on out, we don't have to have that confusion between Yerba Buena and San Francisco anymore. We're just going to call it San Francisco. Okay, that is the end of the first lecture today. In the next one, we are going to talk about the gold rush and California becoming a state. So it's kind of big.